The church bell that rings for no reason. It started with the bell, a single hollow clang in the middle of the night. At first, I thought I imagined it. I was visiting my grandmother in her small town, a quiet, forgotten place where the air smelled of old wood and the streets emptied by sundown. She lived just a few blocks away from St. Augustine's Church, a towering relic that had stood for over a century. The church hadn't held a service in years. The congregation had dwindled, the priest had passed away, and the doors were locked indefinitely. Yet for some reason the bell still rang. The first night I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A deep, resonant clang. I checked the time, 1:06 a.m. Then another, and another. 3 times in total. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked my grandmother the next morning. She didn't look up from her knitting. "Hear what?" "The church bell. It rang last night." At that, she froze. Her hands trembled just slightly before she placed the yarn down. "That bell hasn't rung in years." I frowned. "No, I heard it. 3 times." She looked out the window, her face suddenly distant. "Don't pay it any mind," she murmured. I should have listened. The second night, I stayed up this time. I kept the lights off, watching through the sheer curtains of my window. The church stood like a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, its steeple reaching upward, the bell tower silent. Then at exactly 1:06 a.m., it rang again. Clang. A gust of wind rattled the trees. Clang. The streetlights flickered. Clang. Silence. I grabbed my jacket. I had to see it for myself. The streets were empty. The town was dead quiet. I walked toward the church, my breath visible in the cold air. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt, like something was watching me. The church doors were locked, but I could see through the cracked stained glass windows. The inside was dark. Dust-covered pews, a rotting altar, abandoned. I stepped back and looked up at the bell tower. There was no one there. I turned to leave. That's when I saw them, at the edge of the graveyard, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight. Shadows, not people, not quite. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I ran. The third night I told my grandmother everything. She listened without interrupting, her face pale. When I finished, she sighed and sat me down at the kitchen table. "There's something you need to know," she said, voice quiet. She told me the story. The legend of St. Augustine's Church. Decades ago, a fire broke out during a midnight service. The doors, for some reason, had been locked from the outside. The priest and 13 members of the congregation burned alive inside. People claimed the priest had done it himself, a ritual, a sacrifice. Others believed something worse had been inside that church that night. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. Ever since the fire, the bell rings by itself. Always at 1:06 a.m., the time the fire started. Always 3 times. One for the priest and one for each of the souls that perished. And sometimes people see them, the ones who never made it out. I wanted to leave. I begged my grandmother to let me go home early. But that night, the storm came. A relentless downpour, wind shaking the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. I tried to sleep. Then clang. I shot up in bed. Clang. The rain pounded against the roof. The wind howled. Clang. Then something worse. A knock. Not at the door, at my window. I turned slowly, my stomach knotting. Lightning flashed, and for a split second I saw it. A charred figure, standing outside watching me. The skin was blackened and cracked, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. I pulled the blankets over my head like a child, praying it would go away. The knocking stopped, but I knew it was still there. The final night, I left town the next day. My grandmother didn't stop me. As I packed, she handed me a small silver cross. "Keep this with you," she said, "and whatever you do, never look back." I didn't. As I drove away, I saw the church one last time in my rearview mirror. The bell tower stood empty. But I swear, even over the sound of the rain, I still heard it. Clang, clang, clang. The face in the mirror that isn't mine. It started with a crack, a thin, almost imperceptible fracture in the mirror above my bathroom sink. I don't even remember how it got there. Maybe it had always been there, and I never noticed. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That was the first night the reflection changed. The first glimpse, I was brushing my teeth, the fluorescent light flickering softly. My reflection moved as I did, at first. Then for a split second, it didn't. I froze. Had I imagined it? I leaned closer, inspecting the mirror. My own tired eyes stared back at me, rimmed with exhaustion. Then as I turned to leave, a smirk. I hadn't smiled. I whipped back around, my heart slamming against my ribs. My reflection looked normal again. Just stress, I told myself. Lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The wrong movements. Over the next few days, it got worse. I started catching my reflection lagging, blinking a second too late, turning its head just a bit too slow. Sometimes it didn't match me at all. One night, I stood completely still, staring into the mirror. My reflection should have been still too. It wasn't. Its fingers twitched, just slightly. But I saw it. I slammed the mirror shut and stumbled out of the bathroom, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was in there, something that wasn't me. It spoke a week later. It did something worse. It spoke. I had just finished washing my face, my skin damp and cool. I reached for my towel, patting my face dry, and when I looked up, it wasn't my face staring back. It was still me, but off. The eyes were darker, sunken, the skin paler, the expression wrong. Then it grinned. "Let me out," I screamed. The sound was swallowed by the walls, the silence pressing in around me. I ran out, slamming the door behind me. That night I covered the mirror with a sheet. The reflection moves without me. I avoided the bathroom for days, but I had to see it again. I had to know. So after nearly a week, I pulled the sheet down. For a moment, everything seemed fine. My reflection looked normal, mirroring my every move. Then I lifted my hand. My reflection lifted the opposite hand. I felt my blood run cold. Slowly, I lowered my arm. The reflection didn't move. I took a step back. It took a step forward. It was moving on its own. Then it spoke again. "You don't belong here." And then it smiled. "It wants to take my place." I stopped looking in the mirror altogether. I even covered the mirrors in my bedroom, in the hallway. I couldn't risk seeing it again. But the worst part? I could still feel it watching me. Even without seeing it, I knew. Somewhere in some reflection, it was waiting. And it was getting closer. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint whisper. "You don't belong here." I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the sheets. Then, a soft tap. Not at my door. Not at my window, at my closet mirror. I hadn't uncovered it, but I knew somehow it had uncovered itself. The final night, I made a mistake. I looked. I don't know why. Some twisted curiosity, some pull I couldn't resist. But I tore the sheet off the closet mirror, and there it was. Not me, not anymore. It was grinning, eyes black pits, teeth too sharp, and it reached out. Not from behind the glass, from my side. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and then it stepped out. I'm not sure I'm me anymore. I don't know what happened after that. All I know is, when I woke up, the mirror was shattered. 1,000 broken pieces, glistening on the floor. And I was lying in the middle of them. But something is wrong. My hands don't feel like my hands. My voice sounds off. And every time I pass another mirror, the reflection smiles before I do. The house that cries at midnight, I should have never moved into that house. It seemed perfect at first. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, plenty of space. But I didn't know. I didn't know that every night, as the clock struck midnight, the house would start to cry. The first night. The first night, I barely noticed it. I was exhausted from unpacking, half asleep on the couch when I heard it. A faint, distant sobbing. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a neighbor. But as I sat up, rubbing my eyes, I realized something strange. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. A slow, wretched weeping. Like someone was mourning, and it was coming from the walls. The second night. The next night, I listened more carefully. As soon as the clock struck 12, the weeping started again. This time, it was louder, closer. I walked around the house, trying to find the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls, the floors, the ceiling. I pressed my ear to the living room wall. The sobbing grew louder. It sounded like a woman, trapped, begging. I pulled back, my skin crawling. Then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "Help me." I spun around, my heart pounding. There was no one there. The history of the house, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went into town and started asking questions. That's when I learned the truth. Years ago, a woman had lived in that house, a young mother. Her husband was an abusive man, cruel and violent. One night, the neighbors heard screams, then silence. The next morning, the woman was gone. The husband told everyone she had left him, but she never showed up anywhere, never contacted her family. And after a few months, the husband disappeared too. The house had been empty ever since, until me. And now, every night at midnight, she cried. The third night, the shadow, I thought about leaving, but the rent was too good, so I convinced myself it was just a lingering energy, a haunting without harm. I was wrong, because on the third night, the sobbing turned into screaming. Ear-piercing, heart-wrenching screams that filled the house. I bolted upright in bed, my body covered in sweat. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, coming toward my room. I held my breath, gripping the covers. Then from the corner of my eye, a shadow moved, tall, looming, standing just outside my bedroom door. And then the door creaked open. The confrontation, I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The shadow stepped inside. I could feel its presence, cold, hateful, watching me. Then the sobbing woman's voice, whispering, desperate, "Run." I snapped out of my trance and flipped on the light. The shadow vanished. But the room was ice cold, and on my bedroom mirror, a message, written in something dark, maybe dirt, maybe blood. He never left. The final night I packed my bags, I was done. But as I was about to leave, I heard something new, a sound that made my stomach drop, a deep, guttural growl. Not from the walls, not from the woman, from right behind me. I turned slowly, and I saw him, a figure standing in the hallway, his face twisted with rage, eyes black pits, mouth grinning too wide, and in his hand, a knife. The same knife I realized that had been used to silence her. The sobbing grew louder, desperate, and then everything went black. I never went back. I woke up in my car. The house was dark behind me, silent. I don't know how I got there. All I know is I never went back. And now every time I pass that street at midnight, I still hear it. The house crying, still trapped, still waiting.